At 78 years old, Edward Thompson thought he had finally secured peace for his family. Retired construction worker from Kingston, Ontario. Edward had built homes for others his entire life, but never truly had one he could proudly call his own. With the help of his savings, and by selling his modest bungalow, he purchased a spacious 3-bedroom house, hoping it would be a safe haven not only for himself but also for his son Michael and daughter-in-law, Lisa Michael. Lisa had been struggling in a small rented apartment in Ottawa. Rising rent, delayed paychecks, and the looming threat of eviction weighed heavily on them. Edward, remembering the fear of not knowing where you'll sleep at night, refused to let his son go through that. So he gave up everything familiar. To him, the house he had lived in for decades, to buy this new home. In Edward's heart, it wasn't just bricks and mortar. It was a symbol of sacrifice, of love, and of a father's unwavering commitment to family. On moving day, Edward prepared hot coffee and fresh bread, watching with pride as Michael and Lisa carried their belongings into the rooms he had chosen. For them, the walls smelled of fresh paint, and the future felt bright. For a fleeting moment, he believed this was the start of something better for all of them, but Edward had no idea that what he saw as a gift would soon turn into his greatest trial. That evening, when Edward returned from a walk to the corner store, he noticed something unusual. A moving truck was parked outside his new house. At first, he thought Michael and Lisa had arranged for a few extra pieces of furniture. But as he stepped closer, the scene came into focus. Mattresses, dressers, bicycles, and even an old recliner were being unloaded by strangers. To Edward's surprise, Lisa's parents were among them. Her mother Margaret waved casually as if she were already home. Behind her came her father, carrying a box of kitchen utensils. 2 of Lisa's brothers followed, dragging in bicycles, and a teenage cousin laughed loudly as he dropped his backpack right on the porch. Edward froze for a moment, coffee and bread still in his hands, watching as his house filled with people he had never agreed to live with. When he asked what was happening, Lisa simply smiled and said, "They'll stay for a few days while they get settled." But Edward knew, from the way those boxes were stacked in the living room, that this wasn't temporary. Within days, his fears were confirmed. Margaret reorganized the kitchen, moving Edward's pots and pans to a corner as though they were clutter. Her husband claimed a section of the living room for his belongings, while Lisa's brothers leaned their bicycles against Edward's freshly painted porch. The house that Edward had bought with years of sweat and sacrifice suddenly felt less like a home and more like a crowded boarding house. What hurt him most wasn't just the intrusion. It was Michael's silence. His son avoided eye contact, slipping into his room with Lisa whenever Edward lingered too long in the hallway, and when Michael finally spoke, his words cut deep. "Dad, this house is for my family now. If you want to stay, you'll have to help out." Edward didn't shout. He didn't argue. Simply looked down at his weathered hands, the same hands that had built this life, and chose silence. But inside, something shifted. Every corner of his home began to shrink. The living room echoed with laughter that wasn't his. The kitchen smelled of meals cooked without his presence. Even the patio, once his favorite place for morning coffee, was cluttered with bicycles and boxes. The man who had paid for the roof above their heads was slowly being treated as though he were just in the way. One morning, Edward carried his cup of coffee outside. The sun rose over the quiet Ontario street, painting the sky in shades of gold. It should have been peaceful, yet behind him, the sounds of Lisa's family stirred a blender roaring, loud voices arguing about breakfast, the cousin shouting into his phone. He felt like a stranger in the very place he had dreamed of calling home. Later that day, as he passed the kitchen, he overheard Margaret whispering to Lisa, "This house is perfect for all of us. Edward is old. He doesn't need so much space." Anymore, they didn't know he was standing nearby, or maybe they did and didn't care. Edward said nothing. Instead, he went to his room, opened the drawer where he kept the deed, and ran his fingers over the paper. His name, clear and bold, reminded him of the truth they were trying to erase. This was still his house. From then on, his routine changed. He cooked only for himself, no longer laying out breakfast for everyone, washed his own dishes, and kept his food tucked away in a small cupboard. When Lisa's brother demanded he hurry sweeping the porch, Edward replied calmly, "I sweep. At my own pace." His words weren't loud, but they carried weight. These small acts of quiet defiance unsettled them. They were used to him staying silent, bending under the pressure. But Edward wasn't broken. He was waiting. Each night, as the house filled with chatter and television noise, Edward sat on the porch, remembering the little boy Michael once was, the boy he'd built a wooden tricycle for, the boy who once clung to him after being bullied at school. Somewhere along the way, that boy had forgotten his father's worth, and Edward, though patient, knew one thing with certainty. He would not allow himself to be erased from his own life, Michael's. Silence weighed on Edward more than the chatter of the crowded house. It wasn't just that his son avoided eye contact or slipped past him in the hallway. It was the way Michael seemed to vanish whenever respect was on the line. The young man who once clung to his father's leg, who once called him his hero, now stood behind his wife and her family, letting them rearrange his father's world piece by piece. The breaking point came one evening at dinner. Edward had been left out again, a single plate of leftovers waiting on the counter while the others ate around the table. As he warmed his meal in the microwave, he overheard Michael telling Lisa, "Dad just needs to accept this house is ours now. He's better off staying out of the way." Those words struck like a hammer. Edward didn't interrupt or lash out. Instead, he carried his plate to the porch, sat in the cool night air, and stared at the quiet street. The truth was suddenly clear. His son valued the roof over his head more than the man who had provided it. For the first time, Edward felt a pang of grief deeper than loneliness. It wasn't only about space or property, it was about watching his own blood choose convenience over loyalty. And in that moment, Edward realized something powerful. His silence had been mistaken for weakness. From then on, he changed. He stopped waiting for respect and started drawing invisible lines of his own. Locked his bedroom door when he left, not because he was afraid, but because he knew boundaries had to be seen to be honored. He began keeping his groceries separate, tucking them into a small cupboard he alone opened. When Lisa's brother asked him to run errands, Edward's calm reply was, "Handle it yourself." These weren't acts of rebellion, they were reminders. Reminders that he was not a servant, not a guest, but the man whose name was etched on the deed. The more he quietly asserted himself, the more tension filled the rooms. Margaret frowned when Edward refused to sweep the porch on her command. The teenage cousin muttered under his breath when Edward reclaimed his seat on the porch with a firm, "This chair belongs here." And though no voices were raised, the atmosphere thickened, like a storm waiting to break. But what unsettled them most wasn't Edward's words, it was his composure. He didn't shout, didn't slam doors, didn't play their game. He carried himself with the steady patience of a man who had laid brick walls and poured foundations. A man who knew how to wait until the cement hardened before moving on. One evening, Michael entered Edward's room uninvited. His face was tight, his voice low. "Dad, you're making everyone uncomfortable. Why can't you just go along with things?" Edward closed the newspaper in his hands, looked up, and answered softly, "Son, peace doesn't come from ignoring disrespect. It comes from stopping it before it grows." Michael had no response. He left the room, shutting the door harder than necessary. But Edward didn't flinch. For him, the words had been enough. Later that night, as Edward sat alone on the porch, memories returned. He remembered Michael as a boy, running barefoot in the yard, laughing as Edward fixed a broken toy truck with tape and glue. Back then, Michael trusted his father's hands to solve anything. Now, those same hands were seen as old, worn, and unnecessary. It hurt, but Edward wasn't broken. If anything, the sting of betrayal sharpened his resolve. He knew the fight ahead wasn't about furniture or food, it was about dignity. Edward Thompson had lived long enough to know that once you surrender your dignity, you may never get it back. He sat back, watching the last light fade from the sky, and whispered to himself, "They think I've been defeated. They have no idea." Because deep inside, Edward knew The real battle was just beginning, one quiet afternoon. When the noise of the house grew too heavy, Edward slipped away into the only room that still felt like his, the study his late wife, Helen, had once filled. With her books, dust gathered on the shelves, sunlight spilled across her old oak desk, and for a moment, it felt like stepping back into a time when respect and love were natural. It's not something he had to fight for, as Edward opened the bottom drawer. His hand brushed against a blue folder he hadn't noticed in years. It was heavier than it looked. Inside, he found a bundle of documents, bank accounts in Helen's name, letters from a law office in British Columbia, and a deed to a property he never knew existed. His hands trembled as he unfolded one paper. After another, there it was, in black and white. Helen had purchased a small lakefront cabin near Kelowna, tucked away in her name alone. Beneath the deed, Edward found a life insurance policy. Not for Michael, not for Lisa, but for his granddaughter, Emily, Michael's little girl, who was barely old enough to write her name. Helen had thought ahead, protecting the one innocent soul in the middle of it all. And then, at the very bottom, there was a letter. Helen's handwriting was unmistakable, flowing but firm. Edward read it slowly, his breath catching. On each line, she wrote that she knew their children might one day see the house, the savings, and the property not as pieces of family history, but as assets to divide. She urged him to be careful, to never let anyone push him out of what they had built together. And in one chilling sentence, she told him, "Edward, if they ever try to take your ground, use the cabin as your escape. Remember, you have options." He sat there in silence, the weight of the folder pressing against his chest. All this time, while he thought he was cornered, Helen had left him a way out. She had trusted him to be strong when she no longer could. Closing the folder, Edward felt a spark he hadn't felt in months. Not anger, not grief, but resolve. He realized that the family filling his house with noise and disrespect didn't know the full picture. They believed he was an old man clinging to one home, when in reality he had more power, more protection than they imagined. That night, Edward laid the folder on his desk and spread out the documents like puzzle pieces. He made 3 columns. On a notepad, what they know, what they don't know, what I want them to think. In the first column, he wrote, "This house, my silence, their assumptions." In the second, he listed cabin in Kelowna, bank accounts, legal contacts. And in the third, he wrote simply, "That I am tired, that I will surrender." Offered. For the first time in weeks, Edward smiled, understood that patience wasn't weakness. Patience, when guided by knowledge, could become the sharpest weapon. Over the next days, his demeanor changed. He walked with a quieter confidence, spoke less, but looked people directly in the eye. When Michael's in-laws barked orders, Edward didn't argue. He just nodded and did what he felt was necessary, nothing more. What they saw was an old man retreating. What Edward knew was that he was preparing. Late one evening, Edward locked his door, sat with Helen's letter in his lap, and whispered aloud as though she were still beside him. "You knew, didn't you? You knew they'd try this." His voice cracked, but it wasn't from sorrow, it was from gratitude. Even in death, Helen was protecting him, guiding him toward strength. As he placed the documents back into the folder, Edward realized something else. He wasn't just defending a house. He was defending his dignity, his legacy, and the quiet truth that no one, family or not, had the right to erase a lifetime of sacrifice. And though the house buzzed with voices and laughter that night, Edward lay in bed with a calm heart. For the first time since this storm began, he felt the shift inside him. The fight wasn't over, but when it came, he would no longer be unarmed. After finding Helen's folder, Edward knew he couldn't rely on silence alone. He had been patient, but patience without preparation was just waiting to be overrun. Now, armed with knowledge, he needed to protect himself. The next morning, while the house was still quiet, Edward slipped out before anyone else stirred. The streets of his Ontario town were calm at dawn, shopkeepers lifting shutters, the air crisp and cool. He walked with purpose to the post office and rented a small P.O. box under his name. It was a simple step, but it meant that anything important letters, legal documents would be safe from curious hands at home. Later that week, Edward phoned an old acquaintance, Peter Alvarez, a lawyer he had once worked alongside when doing renovations for a courthouse. Peter was older now, his voice slower, but still sharp. Edward explained, carefully but firmly, that he needed legal advice about property rights and privacy. He didn't reveal every detail, just enough for Peter to understand the urgency. Within a day, Peter had reviewed the deed and confirmed what Edward already knew. His ownership was absolute. And with a few formal letters, they could make sure no one challenged it. That confirmation gave Edward a quiet strength. At night, while the house bustled with noise, he'd sit in his locked room sketching out what he called his escape routes. Not escape as in running away, but ways to take back control if things worsened. On one sheet of paper, he listed trusted contacts. Don Manuel, a lifelong friend from the construction trade. Don Ernesto, who had connections at the town office. Peter Alvarez, his lawyer. And now, Ano the caretaker, who managed the cabin Helen had bought in Kelowna. Each one was a piece of a puzzle, a safety net that no one else knew existed. Edward also began tidying his affairs. He opened a small savings account at the local credit union, moving portions of his money gradually so no one noticed sudden changes. He gathered photographs, tools, and personal mementos into boxes labeled Go, Stay, and Travel. The Go box was filled with things he couldn't replace: Helen's letters, Emily's drawings, a watch his father had left him. The Stay box contained furniture and items he'd leave behind without regret. And the Travel box held essentials he might carry with him if he chose to leave quietly one day. His strategy wasn't born of fear, it was born of clarity. Edward knew that if you wanted to hold on to your dignity, you had to prepare for the moment when others tried to strip it away. Meanwhile, inside the house, nothing seemed to change on the surface. Lisa's family still filled the kitchen with chatter, Michael still kept his head down, and Edward still moved through the rooms with calm restraint. But beneath that calm was a man quietly arming himself with every tool he had: documents, allies, and patience. One evening, as the family gathered in the living room watching television, Edward sat outside under the stars. He remembered his father's words from decades ago. Son, the land you work with your hands is yours. But don't ever forget you must defend it too. Now the land was brick and lumber, not soil, but the meaning was the same in that moment. Edward realized he wasn't just defending property. He was defending the life he and Helen had built, the sacrifices they had made, and the memory of a love that had lasted a lifetime. And as the laughter of Lisa's relatives echoed from inside, Edward smiled faintly to himself. They thought they were winning, that they had pushed him into the role of a weary old man, too tired to resist. But what they didn't see was the quiet fire Helen had left burning in him. Edward wasn't done, not by a long shot. Edward had always believed that real strength didn't come from raising your voice. It came from knowing more than the people who underestimated you. That belief, once learned on construction sites where a missed measurement could ruin a job, now guided him. Inside his own home, one evening, with the noise of the television rumbling through the walls, he sat at his desk and pulled out a yellow notepad. Across the top, he wrote 3 headings: what they know, what they don't, what I want them to think. In the first column, he wrote with steady strokes: this house, my silence, my age. These were the pieces they believed they understood that. He was just an old man too tired to fight, a man clinging to one property he couldn't defend. In the second column, he listed what they didn't know: the cabin in Kelowna, Helen's savings, my lawyer, my friends. Each word reminded him that he was far less vulnerable than they imagined. Beneath the surface of his quiet exterior was a safety net strong enough to hold him no matter how hard they tried to push. And in the third column, perhaps the most important, he wrote that I am weary, that I will give up. This was the illusion he intended to maintain. Because Edward knew that when people believed they had already won, that was when they became careless. From that day forward, Edward began to live by his 3 columns. In the mornings, he rose earlier than everyone else, fixing his coffee and enjoying the cool silence before the house awoke. When Margaret asked him to fetch water or sweep the porch, he obeyed just enough to look harmless, but never so much that he lost his self-respect. He'd let them think they were bending him into submission, when in reality, he was measuring every move they made. His patience was not passive. It was calculated. Each moment of silence was another brick in the foundation of his plan. One afternoon, Michael stopped him in the hallway. "Ed, Lisa thinks you've been distant lately. Is something wrong?" Edward smiled faintly and answered, "I'm fine, son. Just tired." He watched as Michael's shoulders relaxed, reassured by the act. But behind Edward's calm eyes, his resolve only hardened. At night, when the others were asleep, Edward walked through the house in his socks, memorizing the placement of their belongings. The bicycles in the yard, the boxes stacked in the spare bedroom, the clutter in the shed. He wasn't snooping, he was studying, measuring how much space they had claimed and how much of it could be taken back in a heartbeat. He thought of it the way he once thought, about pouring concrete. Timing mattered. Pour too soon, and the form would collapse. Wait until the mixture set, and the structure would last for decades. The people inside his home believed they had cornered him. What they didn't see was that Edward was already drawing the blueprint for how this would end. Sometimes, sitting alone on the porch, he whispered Helen's words under his breath. "If they try to take your ground, remember, you have options." Those words were both a warning and a promise. And while the family inside laughed at sitcoms and bickered over meals, Edward sat quietly under the stars, sketching out the final shape of his plan. They thought his silence meant defeat. But Edward knew better. Silence, when sharpened by memory and patience, could cut deeper than any outburst. The game had changed. He was no longer simply enduring their disrespect. He was waiting for the perfect moment to remind them who he truly was, the man who had built homes with his hands, raised a family through hardship, would never surrender the ground he had earned. And though no one else realized it yet, Edward Thompson was preparing not just to survive, but to take back everything that was his. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon. Michael knocked on Edward's door, his tone unusually formal. "Dad, we need to talk. Lisa's uncle is coming over tonight. He's a lawyer." Edward didn't flinch. He closed the folder he'd been reviewing, tucked it neatly back into his desk drawer, and simply replied, "All right, son, I'll be here." That evening, the living room was arranged like a meeting hall. Lisa sat stiffly beside Michael, her arms crossed, while her uncle, a man in a crisp suit who smelled faintly of cologne and arrogance, set down his briefcase on the coffee table. The chatter of the house quieted as Margaret and the others gathered in the doorway, waiting to hear how this confrontation would play out. "Mr. Thompson," the lawyer began, addressing Edward with the kind of tone reserved for troublesome clients, "there are concerns about the current living arrangement. This home, though technically in your name, has become a shared residence. It would be in everyone's best interest to discuss how ownership might be adjusted." Edward sat back in his chair, hands folded calmly in his lap. He studied the man's expression, then turned to Michael. "Is that what you want, son? Would adjust ownership of the house I bought with my own hands?" Michael shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. Lisa spoke instead, her voice sharp. "Dad, this isn't just about you anymore. We're a family, need stability, and the house should reflect that." The room fell silent. For a moment, Edward let the words hang in the air. Then, with deliberate slowness, he leaned forward. "Stability doesn't come from taking what isn't yours. It comes from respect. Respect is something that's been missing in this house for a long time." Lisa's uncle cleared his throat, preparing to counter, but Edward raised a hand. "Let me be clear. My name is on that deed. My name is on the land registry. This house is mine. And while I am willing to share my roof, I will not surrender my rights or my dignity. Not to you. Not to anyone." The firmness in his voice startled even Margaret, who had been so used to his quiet compliance. For the first time, they all saw that Edward wasn't bluffing. He continued, his gaze sweeping across the room. "If you wish to live here, you will follow my rules. You will treat me with respect. And if that's too much to ask, The door is right there. The lawyer shifted uncomfortably, sensing the ground slipping from under his prepared speech. Mr. Thompson, perhaps we should avoid ultimatums. Edward cut him off with a steady look. Ultimatums aren't given, sir. They're earned. This one's been earned by weeks of disrespect under my own roof. Michael finally spoke, his voice cracking under the weight of the moment. Dad, please. Can't we just find a compromise? Edward turned to him, his expression softening, but his words remaining firm. Son, I compromised the day I sold my bungalow to buy this house for you. I compromised when I let your in-laws turn my kitchen upside down. I compromised every time I ate alone while you all sat together. A compromise without respect isn't compromise, it's surrender, and I will not surrender. The room grew. Heavy with silence, Lisa's uncle snapped his briefcase shut, muttering something about legal complications. Margaret pursed her lips, but said nothing, and Michael lowered his eyes, unable to meet his father's steady gaze. Edward stood, his voice quieter now but no less powerful. This is not a boarding house. This is my home. If you wish to remain here, you do so as guests, not as owners. If you cannot accept that, then you know what to do. With that, he left the living room and closed his bedroom door behind him. For the first time in weeks, Edward felt the weight lift from his chest. He had not shouted. He had not raged. He had simply spoken the truth, and in that truth was a boundary no lawyer could erase, no relative could undermine. It was the quiet strength of a man who had finally drawn the line. A week after the confrontation in the living room, a thick envelope arrived at Edward's P.O. box. He carried it home, tucked under his arm, not rushing to open it, letting the weight of it sit until he was behind the safety of his locked door. Inside were official papers from the law office in British Columbia. The language was formal. The message was unmistakable. The cabin Helen had purchased years earlier now belonged solely to him. The deed bore his name, his alone, stamped and signed. For a moment, Edward simply stared at it, running a finger along the ink, as though touching proof that Helen was still watching over him. That night, sitting at his desk with only a lamp burning, he spread the cabin documents beside the deed to his house. The contrast struck him to properties, two lifelines. One rooted in the battle he was fighting now, the other waiting quietly in the distance like a refuge he had never imagined. He wasn't trapped. He had choices. Choices, he realized, were power. The next morning, Edward began what he called the sorting. He pulled out old boxes, laying his belongings in careful piles across the bed. In one stack, the things he would keep close: photographs of Helen, his father's pocket watch, the blue folder, a handful of letters Emily had written in her shaky child's handwriting. Another pile grew with items he could part with, things that carried no more than dust and memory. And then there was the third pile of objects that didn't belong to him at all. Michael's hockey gear from high school, long forgotten in the closet. Lisa's kitchen gadgets that had somehow migrated into his cupboards. Even trinkets from Lisa's brothers, stuffed carelessly into corners of the garage. Edward boxed each item, labeling the cartons with neat handwriting. Returned to Michael. The following week, a moving truck stopped at the house. Edward had arranged it quietly, through a friend from his construction days. As the men hauled out box after box, he stood at the doorway with his arms crossed, his expression calm but firm. Lisa's brothers looked on, their faces sour. Michael approached, confused. "Dad, what are you doing?" Edward answered without raising his voice. "I'm returning what belongs to you, keeping what belongs to me." The words struck harder than any shout. Michael opened one of the boxes, seeing his own belongings carefully packed inside, each item cushioned as though Edward had done it with respect, not spite. For a moment, he didn't know whether to feel ashamed or angry. By evening, the last box was gone. The house felt lighter, not just in clutter but in spirit. Edward walked through the room slowly, as though reclaiming the space one step at a time. For the first time in months, he could see the floor of his garage, the clean line of his hallway, the empty chair on the porch waiting just for him. That night, Michael confronted him in private. His face was red, his voice sharp. "Being selfish, Dad. We're family. Families share." Edward looked at him steadily, his tone even. I shared, son. I gave up my home, my savings, my comfort, but sharing doesn't mean being erased. This house is mine, and I'll remind you of that as many times as it takes." Michael's mouth opened as if to argue, but no words came. He turned and left the room, slamming the door behind him. Edward didn't chase after him. He didn't need to. The message had been delivered later that evening. As Edward sat alone on the porch, the summer air warm around him, he thought about Helen again. She had always known when to let go and when to hold her ground. He realized now that she'd left him more than a cabin and a folder. She'd left him her wisdom, her quiet strength, and with every small act of reclaiming, Edward felt her presence more clearly guiding him, reminding him that dignity is not something handed to you. It's something you defend, piece by piece, until those around you have no choice but to see it. It didn't take long for Michael's frustration to boil over. For weeks he had avoided direct conflict, hiding behind Lisa's complaints or his in-laws' demands. But one evening, as the summer heat pressed down on the house and tempers were already thin, he finally snapped. Edward was sitting at the kitchen table, quietly polishing his boots the way he had for years, when Michael stormed in. His voice was sharp, almost trembling. "Dad, do you realize what you're doing? You're tearing this family apart. You're selfish. You care more about control than about us." Edward looked up slowly, not startled, not shaken. He set the rag aside and folded his hands on the table. His silence seemed to irritate Michael even more. "I'm breaking my back trying to hold this family together," Michael continued, his face red. "And you sitting here with your paperwork and your rules? You're making me the bad guy? Should be grateful we even let you stay." The words landed heavy in the air, crueler than Michael probably realized. For a moment, Edward studied his son, searching for the boy he once knew, the boy who used to run across the yard barefoot, chasing fireflies with a jar. But that boy was nowhere in sight. In his place stood a man blinded by entitlement and fear. Finally, Edward spoke. His voice was calm, steady, the kind of tone that cut deeper than shouting ever could. "Michael, I'm not the one tearing this family apart. I'm just refusing to let myself be erased." Michael's fists clenched. "You're impossible," he shouted, pacing the kitchen like a caged animal. "All we've asked is that you stop fighting us. Can't you just let things go?" Edward stood then, slow and deliberate, and looked his son straight in the eye, because letting go of respect is the first step to losing everything else. "And I won't do that, not for you, not for anyone." The two men stood in silence, the tension thick between them. Lisa and her mother hovered in the hallway, listening, but unwilling to intervene. When Michael realized his outburst had changed nothing, his anger turned into something more fragile defeat. His shoulders sagged, his voice lower now. "You've changed, Dad. You're not the man I remember." Edward's expression softened, but his words carried weight. "No, son. I am exactly the man you remember. The difference is, you've forgotten who I was." Michael stared at him, his jaw tight, then turned abruptly toward the hallway. His steps were loud, each one echoing his frustration. Before he reached the door, Edward's voice followed him, firm but quiet. "Respect isn't negotiable, Michael. Remember that." That night, as the house grew silent, Edward walked to his bedroom. He closed the door behind him and, with a steady hand, turned the lock. The click was subtle, almost ordinary, but to him, it was a declaration, boundary. The world outside that door could rage and mutter, but within those four walls, he was still master of his own life. He sat on the edge of the bed, the air heavy with the echoes of Michael's words. Strangely, he felt no anger. What he felt was clarity. He had seen his son for who he had become, a man willing to trade respect for comfort. And though it broke his heart, Edward knew he couldn't fix that for him. Closing his eyes, he remembered Helen's steady presence, her voice in the back of his mind. "Stand firm, Edward. Dignity first." He whispered aloud, almost as if speaking to her. "I'm standing, Helen. I won't fall." As the night wore on, Edward drifted into sleep. Not with sorrow, but with resolve. He had shut the door on Michael's anger not only literally, but in his heart. The message was clear. He would not be swayed, not by guilt, not by shouting. It's not by the weight of his son's disappointment. In the days to come, he knew the battles would grow sharper. But as long as he held firm to that locked door in his soul, nothing and no one could take away the one thing he had left: his dignity. The morning after Michael's outburst, Edward woke before dawn, as he always had. Old habits die hard. He brewed a pot of coffee, the aroma filling his room, and carried a steaming mug out to the porch. The street was quiet, the sky painted in soft shades of orange and pink. For a moment he let himself breathe, steady and calm, the way he used to before a long day's work on a job site. But inside, he knew something had shifted. The shouting, the accusations, those weren't just words thrown in anger. They were proof that his patience had run its course. If he allowed it to continue, he would lose more than space in his own house. He would lose his very sense of self. That day, Edward began making moves in plain sight. He hired movers to return every last box of Michael's old things, sending them back with a short note. This belongs to you. Belongs to me, will stay here. He locked doors that had once been left open, reclaimed his seat at the head of the table, and cooked his own meals without offering to share. Lisa's family bristled. Margaret muttered under her breath about him being difficult. The brothers rolled their eyes, calling him stubborn. But Edward didn't argue. He simply carried himself with a quiet dignity that unsettled them more than raised voices ever could. One evening, when they tried to move furniture into his room while he was in the yard, Edward caught them. He shut the wardrobe door with a firm hand, his eyes sharp but calm. "This room isn't storage," he said. "It's mine. And if you ever forget that, you'll regret it." His voice wasn't loud, but it was final. The young men backed off, mumbling insults as they left. Later that night, he sat alone with the deeds and documents spread across the desk. The cabin in Kelowna, the bank accounts Helen had left, the life insurance for little Emily, it was all right there, proof that he wasn't the helpless old man they believed him to be. He had options, leverage, and above all, the will to act. Days passed, and the atmosphere in the house grew heavier. Meals were taken in silence. Whispers filled the hallways. Michael barely looked at him anymore, and when he did, the shame in his eyes betrayed the conflict in his heart. Edward noticed it, but he didn't press. Some lessons, he thought, can't be taught with words. They have to be lived. And then, one Sunday afternoon, Edward made a stand. With the family gathered in the living room, he walked in carrying a folder. He laid the papers on the table and spoke clearly. "I've given more than enough of myself. I've given time, money, patience, and respect. And I've been met with nothing but entitlement and silence. That ends today." He opened the folder, revealing the house deed and the new legal notices his lawyer had prepared. "This home is mine. The law says it, the deed says it, and I say it. You have until the end of the week to leave. If you choose to stay past that, you'll be leaving with the sheriff's notice instead." Gasps filled the room. Margaret's face flushed with anger. Lisa stammered. "You can't do that," Edward interrupted, his voice calm as ever. "Yes, I can, and I have. The papers are already filed." The silence that followed was louder than any argument. For once, no one dared to push back. Michael's face was pale, torn between loyalty to his wife and the weight of his father's words. Edward stood, collected the papers, and turned toward the hallway. Before leaving, he added quietly, "I didn't start this war, but I'll finish it." And with that, he closed his bedroom door behind him firmly, decisively. Just as he had closed the door on Michael's anger days before. That night, he slept soundly for the first time in months. Friends, Edward's story isn't just about property or paperwork. It's about something far deeper: dignity, respect, the right to stand firm when others try to erase you. Too often we stay silent to keep the peace, but silence without boundaries only feeds disrespect. Edward's choice reminds us that reclaiming your voice, even late in life, is worth every ounce of courage it takes. Now I'd love to hear from you. If you were in Edward's place, what would you have done? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story touched you, make sure to subscribe, because sometimes The right story is the reminder we all need that our dignity is never for sale.